Our last speaker is Dr. Jenny Tung. In sort of the undersell of the century, I think, Jenny's biography on the website says something like, Jenny Tung is an associate professor of evolutionary biology and anthropology at Duke. And it also happens that she just won a MacArthur Genius Award, so can we give her a round of applause? And the cool thing is that she's the third person from Duke to win such an award, and all three of the winners from Duke are women. So another round of applause for that. Another thing that I found in Googling Jenny, and it came out in the press release for her MacArthur Award, was that she's returned to Kenya every year since 2006 to study the same group of baboons. And so maybe we can hear a little bit more about that. But here she is, Dr. Jenny Tung.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I have a long history with Duke, which is usually what people talk about, especially at talks at Duke. I was an undergraduate here, so I'm class of 2003, and also class of 2010. So I did my PhD here as well, and it's really wonderful to see so many people who are enthusiastic about Duke and its various incarnations come be here together for the weekend now. I'll go ahead and just start, because I think that's probably easier to do given constrained time. So the work that my group is interested in is the relationship between social interactions of various sorts, both competitive interactions and the sorts of affiliative interactions that are the basis for friendships and often family bonds, and its consequences for what, when I'm wearing an evolutionary biologist hat, we think about as Darwinian fitness, so fertility and survival, and when I'm talking to many of the people who are interested in how we do as a species, also health-related outcomes. All right, so there is quite a bit of evidence that social relationships matter, at least as something that predicts health outcomes in humans. And if you could see what I want to show you right now, what you'd see is a series of New York Times articles and editorials that pop up over time, pretty much a couple every year that come out that talk about either this idea that we're undergoing this sort of epidemic of loneliness or social isolation that's affecting health outcomes, particularly for the elderly, and also the abundant evidence that differences in another socially structured environment, socioeconomic status, have really marked predictive value, has really marked predictive value for how long we live. All right, so one piece of evidence, for example, comes from large-scale studies of differences in socioeconomic status in the United States and simply how long we live. What we know from recent work that incorporates over 1 billion person-years of data in the United States is that the differences between people who live in the highest percentile of income and the lowest percentile of adult income in the US is a life expectancy of up to 10 years difference, right? That's a huge difference. But I think that might feel unsurprising to people. What authors of that work want to emphasize is that it's actually not a difference between being very wealthy, being really rich, and being in a state of poverty that lends itself to material deprivation. But that actually what we see is a gradient in the relationship between measures of the social environment and health and mortality outcomes. And so what I mean by that is if we just tick down not just from the 1% to the 99%, but 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down, there tends to be a continuous relationship between how much money we make at age 40, how much education we have, how much wealth we bring to bear, and how long we live. So if you made $100,000 in household income at age 40 versus $200,000 of income, that's still a difference in life expectancy on the scale of years. So these kinds of relationships have been known for a while. What's been remarkable about recent studies is simply the scale of the data that's been brought to bear on these kinds of questions. And that's led people who work in fields like sociology, economics, and social epidemiology to posit for some time that although we're very accustomed to thinking about certain types of environmental insults in our lives, right? Poor nutrition, fatigue, infectious disease, that there's this whole other category of things that we should be thinking about quite seriously. And John Castle, who's a social epidemiologist who worked for a little while at the school down the road, framed it as, really what we should be thinking about is the presence of other members of our own species. That is, our social interactions, some of the most important environments in determining how well we live and how long we live. Okay, and sociologists have framed this as the fundamental cause of disease, so that the idea that social interactions always predict how well we do down the road, no matter what the relevant cause of death is for the particular population or time we might be living in. So that's a really interesting idea, but it's a very challenging idea for biologists like me, because it doesn't give us anything to sink our teeth into, right? What kind of animal model, or what kind of cellular model, or what kind of experiment can you do to test something that has broad spectrum influences on diseases as different as diabetes and tuberculosis and cardiovascular disease and cognitive decline? In addition, it just simply violates the way we think about studying the causes of disease, sort of like a host, environment, pathogen triad. So I think that the idea that one of the most important predictors of health is actually our social environment has been something that's been relatively neglected in the biological and medical literature. In fact, based on these sort of predictive relationships, one of the things your doctor should be asking you when you go see them is not whether you've been smoking recently, but whether you've had social interactions with people that can provide you social support. I think part of the problem here, of course, is the lack of biological mechanism. And so that's one of the reasons that we study other species, because it turns out there is a long history of people who've been interested in how social interactions influence outcomes like lifespan. And those are behavioral ecologists and evolutionary biologists, which is the tradition I come from. So I study animals in the wild, and you get to see cool videos of them if you could see a screen behind me, so I'm sorry about that. I study rhesus macaques in captivity. I study baboons in the wild. And both of them give us different kinds of insight into the types of processes that link the social environment on one hand to outcomes on the other. I'm very fortunate to be able to study the baboons that I work on. They're wild baboons that live in the south of Kenya, right on the border with Tanzania.
You won't wait.
Actually, because of the foresight of a number of other women who are friends and colleagues and mentors of mine. So the Amboseli Baboon Research Project, which is the name of the project that I work on, was founded in 1971 by Gene Altman. And we've actually been watching those baboons and their descendants now into the 9th generation ever since. So unlike humans, this gives us a level of granularity into the social environment. Very few of us would allow people to just walk around and write down what we do every day, right? That we can't get in humans. And we also can see the entire life course from birth to death. Baboons live a long time, but not as long as humans. What we've learned from that work is that in striking parallels to humans, socially isolated females die earlier. Individuals who have social status can compete with one another to maintain social relationships with desirable partners. And in particular, the social environment in early life has some of the most profound impacts, or predictive impacts anyway, on lifespan that we've ever seen. So baby baboons who lose their mothers in early life, or are born to socially isolated or low social status moms, actually live many years later, on average 10-year shorter lives than do our sort of silver spoon babies who face no major sources of adversity early in life. Just to give you a sense of scale, 10 baboon, like 7 human years is 1 dog year, so like, let's see, one baboon year is three human years, so that's like a difference in 30 years if we scaled it to our own lifetimes. One of the biggest effect sizes we've ever seen in analyzing the data in Amboseli. So together, that's suggesting that, in fact, our dependency on our social relationships have very, very deep roots in our evolutionary history. It's not something that's a weird artifact of the world we live in now with, like, social media and cars and whatever, but it's something that seems to have evolved every time in social mammals, that obligate group living, where you have to live with other individuals of your own species, has evolved. That's quite powerful, actually, because it tells us something about its embedding in our basic biology, and it suggests that we can study other animals in order to learn about ourselves, which is in fact something else that we do in captive rhesus macaques. The reason we study those guys is because, unlike what we can do in humans, we have the ability to directly manipulate the social environment. And that's the sort of gold standard thing to do in science, right, is you change one variable and you ask what happens downstream, right? That's how we establish causality. And in the macaques, what we do is actually organize new social groups where we have a lot of experimental control over what the social status of the individuals in that group who've never known each other before actually is. And I'll just tell you that the basic upshot of our results is that differences in social status alone, okay, where we're feeding them all the same diet and they're living in groups that involve the same number of individuals and they all have equivalent access to healthcare, nevertheless predicts differences in the types of cells that are circulating in our body, the proportions of those cells. They change the way those cells regulate their own genes, and they change those animals' response to pathogen stimuli. So the way that they respond to perceiving a bacterial infection or a viral infection, in fact, changes at a very fine-scaled molecular level. So with that line of research, what we're finding is that these sorts of interactions that are very whole organism, right, that actually require multiple individuals to even model, seem to be able to reach very deeply within our bodies, under the skin, in order to go into our cells and change the molecular processes that govern how they work on a day-to-day basis. So I'll just stop by saying that, together, we can take these sort of natural population studies across the whole life course and pair them with studies in captivity with very fine-scale control over causal inference, and make a strong argument, I think, a strong emerging argument, that the social actually is biological. We often talk about behavior and biology as a separate thing. In fact, we see them as a very integrated whole. So again, I'm sorry, I did have really lovely photos of social mammals for you, but if there's time, I'm happy to ask any questions about anything I've just told
Yes,
you.
definitely. And a round of applause for rolling with the punches on not having AV. So we have time for a few questions.
Thanks. You did an amazing job for no AV. That's so impressive.
Yeah.
So my question is, if I know your research is more on the mammal side, or the, not human side, but do you have any insights on how much social interaction? So if we're talking about isolation or we're thinking about humans, what would tip the scale? And maybe everybody is very individual, but how much social interaction would folks need to combat that feelings of isolation or improve health?
I don't think we know the answer to that. So part of the reason why I think the animal studies have been really valuable is because people have been studying this stuff in humans forever. If I go talk to colleagues of mine who are sociologists, they're like, well, we kind of knew social isolation killed you starting in the late 1800s, right? This is not new, guys. But part of the problem has been disentangling how much of it might be directly causal, right, what they call social causation, versus mediated by the possibility that if you are relatively isolated, you're also not going to the doctor or pursuing a poor diet. If you have low SES, you maybe don't have health care, right? Or maybe are more likely to be exposed to illicit drug use, right? So that's another pathway. And there's also a third pathway where, okay, well, if you are not healthy, then maybe you're also not servicing your social relationships, and maybe you're not holding down a job. So all of these things are happening at the same time in human populations, which makes it really hard to sort of come up with the equivalent of take, X milligrams of aspirin, right, do this much social interaction. One of the things that, I'm not an expert in this, but I think is an emerging picture from work on that, is that if you're assigned to social interactions, this is an intervention that people have tried a little bit, it doesn't work that well. Turns out we can't just randomize you and force you to interact with each other and have that be, for whatever reason, as certainly psychologically, or it turns out as physically meaningful as whatever organic things we're able to do ourselves. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you think some of the trends we're seeing in the workplace are going to also tip that scale because you're seeing more remote workers? You're seeing a loss of culture in the workplace, I think, where you don't have an assigned workstation anymore. You come into some generic room or set of cubicles, and it feels very different as someone who's been in the workplace a long time, watching what's happening, and that there isn't the same level of connectivity to that work family or that employer, perhaps. Just feels very different than it used to be, and I don't know if there's some of that loss of social connectivity as well happening there.
I don't know. My guess is that people are very much interested in the social sciences and the changing nature of work and how it maps onto some of these sort of what are broadly referred to as the social determinants of health. I mean, it's not my area of expertise. I will say again, and maybe this is just like a bunch of plugs for studying animals to help us understand ourselves, right, is that one of the problems with humans is that we have really complex, multi-layered social environments. So we have social relationships and social status at work, but we also have social relationships and social status in our communities, maybe at church, maybe on your softball team. And so, that tends to make assessment of how people's integration into their communities somewhat difficult. What I will say is that when people have tried to do comparisons of what measures matter most, or at least what measures are most predictive, the more information you have on people, right? Not only like, how, if you all named, your 5 best friends and then we made a little network from it, like how central are you to that network? That's one variety of things. But also, do you live with a life partner and is your relationship good? And 3, do you perceive yourself as socially supported? And 4, the more of those different dimensions that are collected, the better the predictors are for what that's worth. So I think that, the changing nature of work is very interesting, but will be very hard to interpret without considering all of the other ways our lives are changing. Yeah.
Got time for one more question?
I'm a lawyer, and maybe these are unfair questions, but there are at least two issues that I've seen really coming to the fore with law and policy, and even in the press recently, which have to do with the impact of isolation on human beings. One is in the penal context, where there's a real movement now to abolish penal approaches to punishment that involve solitary confinement. And the second is, at least in Illinois, where I live, there's been a real backlash against isolation of children in school for disciplinary purposes. So I'm wondering if you're, do you see intersections between the kind of research that you're doing and maybe some of the social policies that we've used in the United States?
Yeah. So I want to be careful about how I answer that question, because I want to separate out what we know from scientific research from my personal perspective on those sorts of things. My personal perspective on isolation as a punishment is that it is torture. The scientific perspective on this, I'm going to appeal again to what we know from animal model research, where this stuff is highly controlled, so people are not, in some sense, selecting into one environment or another. What we know is that housing social animals in relatively isolated conditions does really remarkable things to their disease susceptibility. So Martha McClintock, who's a biologist at University of Chicago, actually did this experiment with a mammary tumor-prone strain of Sprague Dawley rats. Rats are really social. And they were all very likely to develop mammary tumors eventually. That was what they were bred to model. And the difference between relatively socially isolated animals, they were actually not housed alone, and individuals who were housed with social partners was this crazy result where the rate of mammary tumor production was about 80-fold. There are similar kind of results for cancer metastasis in mouse models of cancer, where you can take genetically identical animals and either house them alone or not, and inject tumor cells into their fat pads on their paws. And animals who are socially isolated, you see this rapid metastasis, and you don't in animals who aren't. So there are sets of studies like that again speak very strongly to there being a direct relationship between housing. I think again for animals who have to live, like they evolved to live together with other animals, and downstream outcomes that I think are perhaps a little bit less subjective in terms of how we would gauge their importance to human lives.
Great. Another round of applause for all of our speakers.